lovely to welcome you here. It's also very, very nice to welcome Chris Holmes. He has a very interesting background. He has a degree in zoology, so bear that in mind. And in his own words, climbed the greasy pole and ended up as marketing director with Kraft. You might think the bad guys, but anyway, I think his commercial experience is really interesting. He's also been working with the NHS, and what he's really into. Sorry.
We've got some rocking tunes going on. Yeah, it's actually just a disco. We're not. Oh, it's going to pull all the buttons.
It's the power of it. Power of it. Great. He's into something called self-determination theory, which when I read it, I thought, what is that? Really, what motivates people to do anything that they do? And I can't think of a better person to do a workshop beyond the story, than someone who's into motivation and how to encourage people. So over to you, Chris. He's going to tell you exactly what's going to happen next.
So what's the plan? We're going to spend a little bit of time getting to know each other, partly because this is the after-lunch session and everybody's super smerrily attracting one's blood supply from one's brains and do all sorts of things like that. I'm going to talk very, very briefly about self-determination theory. This is not a long lecture, you'll be pleased to hear. And then you'll see there's a brown envelope on everybody's table, and that's going to be some group work in a short while to actually start thinking about how we might apply these ideas. And then we're going to have a kind of wrap up of the session at the end. But first, before we do that, you'll see that there is a little pile of white cards on your table. And what I'd like to do, just for the next few minutes, you can do it in tables, you can wander around, but is to grab a card. You'll see that on one side are the instructions, on the other side are a series of questions. What I'd like you to do is to jump to your feet in a moment when I say go, find a partner, and ask them one question from your card. Yeah? You've then each got a sort of just under a minute to answer that question, swap cards, and then go round the loop again and find another partner. Okay? And we're going to do this for about 5 minutes just to get people up and energised and getting to know each other. So, on your marks, get set, go! I think it's probably only fair though if I introduce myself, because I have an opportunity to know me. So what I'd like to do with you is share with you my very first piece of wildlife communication, and I'm really proud of this. I think they've got to cue my DVD for me. This is my very first piece of wildlife communication.
What shall we talk about next, George? Football? No.
Not this.
We did that back in Little Two.
It's the next track. Not that piece of communication.
I've seen this side.
Have a break. Have a Kit Kat.
So there you can see what a 3-year Durham University degree in zoology gives you in terms of not anthropomorphizing animals. Yes, I come from the dark side, in that I spent 15 years primarily trying to convince the UK population to eat more chocolate in various guises, which I have to say wasn't a particularly complex and difficult job compared to what we're trying to do now. But as Jane said, I kind of climbed that greasy pole and wondered why on earth I'd spent all that time and energy doing it, and I started applying those ideas to social issues, particularly initially around the kind of concepts of health. And that introduced me to the world of behavioural science, which I was totally blown away by, both as an understanding of what I'd done through really collected and learned wisdom on the commercial side, but also through opening up huge new vistas in terms of opportunities to try and influence things for a sort of positive outcome. And then I've been, since then, applying kind of behavioural science in a whole variety of settings. But I ended up delivering very local community programs to try and increase people's physical activity and risk of chronic illness, and I got deeply frustrated in that process because although we were helping individuals, the scale of funding we had available to us and whether or not that funding was sustained basically meant that we were doing nothing to address the problem. This was in Essex, and we helped about 700 individuals, but the scale of the problem in Essex is about 1 million people. So I sat there thinking, yeah, great, this is good, but really have I made a difference in terms of what I'm doing? So last year I took a step back and I went back to university, and I was interested in how to take the scale and sustainability that consumer markets hold. Yeah? I mean, everybody, hands up who's got a smartphone. Okay. Hands up who had a smartphone 5 years ago. Okay. That's huge level behaviour change. Enormous behaviour change. And yet none of us would have really recognised it as such. Consumer markets have the power to drive behaviour in a way I have not personally seen anywhere else. So how can we harness those things? How can we put them together with social issues? The sorts of things that we're interested in, whether it be environment or personal well-being, informed by what we know in terms of from the academic research, in terms of how to drive things forward, and then bring a whole series of tools from behavioural science to say, okay, how should we execute and deliver these things in the marketplace? And I'm currently working on a concept which is called Make Products Make a Difference. Developing consumer products and services that in themselves deliver social change, but do so by generating revenues that are surplus that can be reinvested in more of the same. Trying to harness these consumer markets for a more powerful and more positive outcome than perhaps we might argue they do at the moment. So it's about using the power of consumerism, it's about applying that knowledge, it's about creating products and services that have positive outcomes, and generating financial surpluses that we can reinvest. Having come from the commercial sector, one of the really interesting things when I started working with government and NGOs was that somehow profit is evil, seemed to be an ideology. Profit is just an equation. It's an equation which is your revenues take away your costs equal your profits. It's not inherently evil or good. The ethics by which one generates profit and the use to which one puts profit, now that's something very different. And I think that profit is an incredibly powerful tool, both in terms of achieving sustainability, but also in terms of a common language that everybody can speak about, are we being successful or not? Well, actually, it's a really effective way of measuring success, is profit. And so we've got 3 live projects working on this area at the moment, one of which is all about reconnecting children with nature, and I think is really exciting and interesting stuff going on. But underpinning that are some of these behavioural tools, and I just want to focus on one of them today, which is this concept of self-determination and self-determination theory. And I think actually this gentleman, who most people are familiar with, came up with it rather nicely. He said, no one will protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. And that's an absolute truism if you begin to unpick behavioural science. Our relationships with things are vitally important as to whether or not we actually engage in any kind of actions in their interest. The previous speaker, Ian, was talking about those things that we are exposed to as children coming back and re-emerging potentially later in life. And I think that's a really key truism. And hence an area I'm focusing on is reconnecting children with nature. But what do you need in order to instill behaviour change? And often people talk about, and certainly when I was working with central government, they were talking about we must provide people with information and knowledge, and that informed choice was the kind of policy mantra at the time. Can I be really clear that information and knowledge may be a necessary precursor to behaviour change, but in of itself, it does not deliver behaviour change. And too often we get lost in the fact that, oh yeah, if people knew more. And because we're passionate about what we're talking about, we can think, well, it's a bit like British people overseas trying to speak or not speak foreign languages. They think if we just speak slower and slightly more loudly, then clearly you'll understand me. And I think we often get lost in that trap because of our passion for our subject. What behaviour change needs is focus. You need to go, what is the behaviour, the specific behaviour that I'm going to try and move and change? That's really challenging for us all because we kind of want to solve all the problems at once, and we come from lots of different organisations that want to solve slightly different problems. But behaviour change requires focus. Inherently, all behaviours exist in a really complex system, and therefore they need a multi-component, a multifaceted approach. Just communication isn't going to work. It's got to be communication with and so on. So my argument would be stories on their own aren't necessarily going to work. What else do we need to have alongside stories in order to enable people to break through and act differently, behave differently? And there's three things that underpin it. One is capacity. Do we as individuals have the capacity to change? And that's a really complex problem. Part of that is about skills and knowledge. Part of it is also, do I believe I can change? We have this concept in behaviour change called self-efficacy, which is really the extent to which I believe I have any control of the outcomes around me, my own life, my own context. Most of the people in this room will have reasonably high levels of self-efficacy. It's a standard distribution bell curve in the population. Lots of the people, certainly when in the work I do on health, lots of the people we're trying to most reach have very low levels of self-efficacy. They just believe they're carried along by the tide of fate, and they have no control over their outcomes and what happens in their lives. Trying to get them to engage in behaviour change, actually what you have to do first is to improve their belief in themselves before you can ask them to take on board complex behaviours. The other one is opportunity. I work a lot on childhood obesity. The opportunity for children to be physically active, particularly outside of school, is a real challenge. And one of the big breaks on that is parents like myself concerned over various fears over child safety, whether that be traffic danger, stranger danger, you name it. People have to have the opportunity to behave in this new way. And finally, in the area I'm going to focus on is they have to have the motivation, the will, the desire to do something. And this is the bit I want to focus on today in terms of self-determination theory. And importantly, and hence why I'm working there I am at the moment, all of this needs to happen over time. I used to run KitKat for the Nestle organisation worldwide. KitKat had been in the UK market at the time 75 years. We'd spent 75 years building a relationship between people and that brand. And it was a very deep emotional relationship at the time. They may argue it's been watered down more recently. But what we need is time. And the problem at the moment with the public funding environment is we never get that time because the money is here this year, gone next year. Or we're all spending most of our time chasing pockets of funding that last for 1, 2 years, etc. And hence why we're looking at, can you use consumer markets to provide a sustainable revenue base for the sorts of things that we need to do. But let's focus on motivation. There are basically, simplistically put, there are two types of motivation. There's extrinsic motivation. You do it not for the thing itself, but you do it because of some potential benefit that you see down the line. Take exams as a great example. Not many people get intrinsic satisfaction out of sitting exams. They sit the exams because they perceive it's a mechanism by which they can achieve other things that they are interested in. Extrinsic motivation. And the other end of the equation is intrinsic motivation. I do it just because I love it. It gives me a huge sense of satisfaction in doing it. Now, originally, that's where Brian and Desi, who were sort of one of the major proponents of self-determination theory, thought things stood. There's a pretty clear dichotomy, extrinsic and intrinsic and so on. What's beginning to emerge now is a much more nuanced understanding of this, is that actually, in many ways, this operates a bit like a continuum. And there's three different aspects that are being identified on this constitution. There is the kind of classic extrinsic regulation stuff. I pay taxes because there's tax legislation. I don't really necessarily pay taxes for other reasons. I sit exams because they get me to another place. There's a concept then of introjected regulation, which basically means actually I do this in protection or in enhancement of my own ego. I do this because I don't want to feel guilty because I haven't done it. The rounds of birthday cards, the rounds of Christmas cards, etc., etc. Phoning up your mum once a month because actually, maybe maybe I don't have the time, etc., but I might feel uncomfortable if I don't. Or actually, I want to feel better about myself. I'm doing this because it enhances my sense of self-worth, how I feel about myself. Then there's another form which is integrated, where actually you genuinely believe in the values and the ethics and morals that underpin what you're doing. You've actually integrated those into your set of beliefs as a human being, and therefore you do things that don't inherently give you pleasure, but actually you think that's the right thing to do. I had a classic example of this the other day. I managed to clip somebody's car with my own. I pulled up, and it was a parked car, they weren't in the vehicle, and I pulled up beyond it, and I sat there and thought, not that I really want to have to give them my number and pay the repair of their car and so on. That doesn't fill me with intense joy. But actually I have a set of values that means, yes, I've gone and left a note on their windscreen and put my number and so on. What's interesting is, as we move in this direction and our motivations get more intrinsic and more higher value motivations, if you like, are capable of driving behaviour, changes in behaviour, we really do now understand what moves this way, from left to right. We understand the things that drive those situations. And they are three things. And I think probably the world of wildlife, for instance, the world of wildlife documentary making, or the world of storytelling, fits very well in this top one, which is this concept of relatedness. Do I feel any emotional connection with this subject matter? And it was interesting this morning that we were talking about, with Harvest, we're talking about character. And we all sat, and I certainly was immediately captivated by Rocky the raccoon. Yeah? And completely, I didn't hear what some of the colleagues said over here for the moments that Rocky was in. Interestingly enough, gentleman with Rocky gave it a name, called it Rocky, made it seem human, achieved it, gave it a personality. And one of the interesting things coming from a zoological academic background is, you can't do that. That's anthropomorphism. You can't imbue animals with characterization and so on, But actually, where that's done very effectively, and this is obviously Nemo, you can see the power that can be gained by making things, creating that emotional connection, creating that relatedness between people. And I think that's an area we probably do really well at. And at the end of the day, we've got a really wonderful subject matter with which to do that. I mean, the range of images available to us to create that relatedness is immensely strong. The next one is competence. And in order to develop a real deep intrinsic motivation for something, it's really important that you actually feel that you're getting in some way better at it, more knowledgeable at it. You're developing your understanding of this topic. And it's interesting, isn't it? How do we really give people an opportunity to do that in the context of the campaigns and the programs that we run? And importantly, how do they know, if we do give them that opportunity, do we give them some feedback? How do they get feedback, yes, that they are in fact improving some sense of competence? Interesting enough, when I was preparing for this speech, I went and played a number of the BBC children's games, and I played the Deadly 60 game, and I realised actually what was interesting about it was the game, and it was giving me feedback because I kept dying in the game, I kept getting eaten by things. But actually the competence that it was driving was my ability to move my fingers on the up and down and right and left cursor button. And I was thinking, hold on a second, is that developing intrinsic motivations in the subject matter? Is that the right competence that's being identified and rewarded in the context of that program? And the final thing that's deeply important in developing intrinsic motivation is the concept of autonomy. And it's come up in virtually every session this morning that we talked about. Tindy talked about the fact that, are we simply swapping effectively one organisation's defined story for somebody else's? Whether it be the RSPB's or the National Trust's or Coke's story that it wants us to buy into. As a population, we're surrounded by stories in the form of brand positionings, and really what we're being asked to do is to buy one or more of those stories to make up our own identity. And what we're losing, and what we've lost, perhaps to a certain extent, is the autonomy to define our own story and actually express that in our lives and in the way we operate and interact. And yet, that underpins intrinsic motivation, really significantly. Then after Jim, we talked about the design of stories, and the comment was made about leaving things out. And it struck me at that moment, well, yes, if you leave things out, you create space in a story for somebody to exercise their autonomy and populate that space with their own imagination. In a similar way, people who, I don't know how you find it in terms of listening to radio, particularly listening to stories on radio, or reading a book versus seeing a film. In a film, somebody else has populated, the vision, the visual component. When you read a book or listen to the radio, you do that for yourself, and somehow it's a much richer experience, a result of using your own autonomy and your own creativity in taking that forward. So these three things are the things that drive much higher levels of intrinsic motivation. And motivation, our desire to do something, is one of the three single, founding pillars of getting people to change their behaviour. So what I'd like to do now is have a kind of go at applying it. What you'll find is, on your tables, there is a brown envelope. I'd like you to violently rip open the envelope and just spend some time as a group getting to know the contents. There's 3 sheets which are sort of set out a bit of a case study in there. And then you'll see there's a worksheet as well. And what I'd like you to do is to discuss amongst yourselves and begin to answer these 3 questions. What evidence of relatedness, competence, and autonomy can you see in the case study in front of you? Can you spot where they've built some of these things in? They may have not done it consciously, but they may be there. Secondly, how would you strengthen those 3 areas? Can you see opportunities? Oh yeah, hold a second, we could do a better job. And then a slightly bigger metaphysical question at the end. Having had that experience of thinking about it, do you believe this is at all relevant to what we do? I know it's relevant to what I do over in the health and well-being context, but one of the questions I wanted to walk away from the conference with is this relevant to the context of environment sustainability? I have to think they're one and the same thing, but that's the question. So those are sort of 3 questions. I'll come around the tables and you can ask me questions of clarification and what have you. And I'll put that back up so that just a memory jump. Right, over to you. Okay, draw your attention back. You haven't quite escaped yet, because I'm going to ask you to sort of provide some feedback in there, so don't relax too much just yet. Okay, thanks very much for engaging with that so strong. So let's start by unpicking some of your thoughts a little bit. Let's see if we kick these around. Who had our friend Steve Baxel, Daily 60? Okay, so what did you think they're doing well? Can you give me a good example of relatedness in here?
That little bear in the corner. He says about chatting about stars, shows and games.
Okay. Chatting about stars, shows and games. So they're
putting a face on it.
Yeah, going to give it a concept. Any other thoughts about where relatedness was good?
Use of the term extreme. Children maybe use that term.
Okay, so that's potentially quite a good trigger word. Yeah, it's certainly very much in keeping with his personality, I think, in the whole Bear Grylls movement, if that's such a thing. Any other thoughts? I mean, clearly, Steve Baxel himself is inherently a key part of relatedness in this program. In fact, I was speaking to a colleague from the BBC this morning, and we were having a debate about to what extent is the brand Steve Baxel and what extent is the brand Deadly 60, and the two, inextricably linked, and what sort of problems does that present for the BBC in terms of talent management and all those kind of things. But yes, I mean, clearly attaching a human being to something, and particularly if that human being clearly has an engaging personality, that is clearly something that drives relatedness. It does have a risk and a problem with it, which is that it's one personality.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the most best performing children's cartoon still is Scooby-Doo. Remarkable. I mean, there weren't that many programs made, and it was made decades ago now. And yet, actually, what it does is it has 4 or 5 really clear key personalities that are expressed in cartoon terms that tap into the vast majority of kids. Oh, that's somebody like me. So people can see, children can see themselves reflected in those cartoon characters. And therefore they will have inherently one that they feel more aligned to or more in keeping with. So when you think about relatedness and particularly giving characters and attaching characters to things, it's worth thinking about a variety of characters. And particularly if you're working with children, there is basic child development processes that are going on in terms of children's ability to understand the concept of personality and character. And there's plenty of science out there to help you design those personalities. So, you know, if you're doing a brief or whatever, actually sit down and say, okay, what personalities are going to express? And then potentially, if it's human beings, go and recruit those types of personality. If you're creating them in the form of cartoon characters, imbue those cartoon characters with those personalities. Relatedness. Any interesting things in terms of competence development in this one?
The ability to register and to save your scores and get your achievements in rather than just playing the game and not able to see your incremental improvement.
Yeah. Certainly there is an aspect of competence and feedback in there. Back to what I was saying in my presentation, is it for the right thing? Actually, if you want people to be intrinsically motivated by nature and the natural world, you know, measuring their competence in pressing cursor keys isn't.
So we contrasted the idea about the competence in pressing jump at the right moment versus the drawing. It's not shown on that screenshot, but the ability to send in your own drawings and have them displayed on the website, which we thought probably was a better measure of competence.
Yeah, that's a great example of competence.
So we put forward the proposition that the 3 things, relatedness, competence and autonomy, are not necessarily equal inside of everything that we've got. So this one, the Steve Maxwell one, is massive on relatedness because it's designed to appeal to children who might not be automatically interested in nature. So it's the edgy, deadly. But you don't want to reproduce that. You don't want to put them into similar situations. So we thought that there was a justifiable imbalance between those 3 areas.
I think there is, and I guess looking at it from what perhaps, I mean, it's a really valid point. And clearly, you don't want to get children to go out and necessarily put themselves in extreme situations. But from our perspective, in terms of looking at environmentalism and sustainability issues, one of the potential criticisms of this is, has it got lost in this? If that's what its aim was, and there's a big assumption there, its aim is entertainment. So, you know. But if its aim is about environmental and conservation, has it got lost in this component and not necessarily sufficiently developing the actual environment sustainability component? Not least because most of the creatures featured on this program are somewhere on the other side of the planet. And they're not necessarily creatures you necessarily find outside your back door, and therefore can engage with, therefore can develop competence in knowledge and so on, and can learn in their own way because you don't have the opportunity to learn.
But it's the trigger to go somewhere else afterwards. It's extremely effective.
Yeah. The question is there the somewhere else?
Of course, the BBC.
We also talk about whether or not the name, calling it deadly dash or a deadly planet, does that nurture the right values in teaching if it does engage in the short term, producing like long-term attitude change in children that you really want with that final ground.
And it's a bit unfair on Deadly 60 because I don't know what it set out with as a set of objectives. So you know, we're measuring it against a set of objectives that it didn't necessarily begin with. So but it's a useful kind of case study. Autumn Watch. Who were the Autumn Watchers? So what do we think the Autumn Watch was doing well?
Relatedness.
Nothing. Relatedness. And why relatedness?
Because they've got 3 characters, and we were saying that some of them you've got a really long historical relationship with, like Michaela Strachan and Chris Packham. No one knows them. But you know, like it's got 3 really strong characters who, you know, you've got a connection with. It's got extra stories about them. their level of relatedness is quite high. And the fact they've got a Flickr site as well, for you to share your photos and discuss with other people, the relatedness to the actual, most of the subject matter is quite good.
And I thought there was an interesting one in here, which is, you won't be able to read it from that now, this is an interesting article that appeared in the Telegraph, which is that apparently Pacman has actually laced the programmes with, I think it's movie titles this year. So there's almost a sort of slightly competition. Can you spot all of the references to movie titles in the programmes that he's committing? And actually, it's an interesting component of competence. Did I get all of that? And a means of re-engaging with the programme on an ongoing basis. Where do you think they could do better?
We thought on that main page, if that is your starting page, and you don't know what Autumn Watch is, you might not get that it's actually about wildlife, because right there is no wildlife on it. We
But
also
some plants. That's
there
part
are some
of wildlife.
trees,
There's some trees.
but there's no. If you're going,
Don't say it in such a
fancy.
negative way.
No,
Trees!
Okay, not the tree part. The trees are lovely, but a lot of people go to watch the wildlife programs for animals, not necessarily for the amazing plant life,
Yay!
which is beautifully represented on their start page.
But it's a background as well. It's not a tree in the foreground, which would maybe.
Sorry.
We had a point related to we were discussing what we could do better, and we reckon whether we want the women to be relating to them or relating to wildlife, but that's a side issue. It was on the character we've got our three middle-aged white people, and we had a whole discussion about audience and who the audience is, and that kind of thing, so you can imagine where we're going with that. So yeah, what they could do better. David Lindo was suggested.
Okay, so their choice of presenters and talent in that context. Okay, and then lastly, who had RSTB, Give Nature a Home? So what did you think they were doing really well?
Everything.
Everything. Now, is there a giveaway there? Oh, come on, any specifics apart from anything?
Yeah. We're 50% RSPB.
Okay, on this table.
So we talked about the fact that with autonomy, people are choosing something to do. So they're able to look at the choice, the range of things that are not necessarily just related to birds eye, there are a range of different things. For competence, you've got the RSPB guide and getting better at identifying wildlife. So that's you've got a way in which people can see something and they can find out what it is that they've actually seen. And then relatedness, when you look at all of that, you've got homes, you've got habitats, the wording, also the font that's being used, so it's all trying to relate that very much to the audience, which for most of the stuff we were looking at is very much sort of family and sort of school orientated. That's what we're looking at.
Any areas that you felt that you could do better at? RSPB table.
It's not all of them, so we can have some.
And we were being mean about ourselves because it's fun to do that.
I think there are examples where people are saying what they're doing for nature, which is great, but they're just names. So somehow personalising that a little bit more. Where are those people coming from? How old are they? Do they look like me? Can I identify with them?
And just,
I didn't believe them until they were just somebody else. Well, they could be. Yeah.
just for the audience purposes, they have a kind of like heroes page. Those people who aren't familiar with this, which basically says so and so's done this and so and so's done that. And yeah, it's a good point. At the moment, they're just names and there's no association with is this a person, is this a person like me.
So you can show you built these tools and structures that you would assume animals would come to. There's nothing to say animals have actually come.
Yeah.
It's made any change.
So there's that sense of kind of ongoing development of competence. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things, I don't know if anybody's seen Project Wild Thing, the film that was released or first premiered in the summer, but which is looking, David Bond and Ashley Jones looking at children's relationship with nature. And one of the things that struck me watching that film was the fact that there are very few guides, and by guides I mean people, that can somehow introduce us and connect us into nature and develop our competence of learning. I mean, interesting enough, that e-guide is incredibly powerful, but actually, if I was somebody who was completely new to birds, oh gosh, it's quite a challenging thing to try and engage in. And I was just, reflecting at a personal level, I was very fortunate to have a grandfather who a genuine countryman, as in lived his life in the country and was deeply immersed in the countryside, and going for a walk with him was just a miraculous experience. You know, when we're talking about the old nature tables and sticking our hands in nature and so on, and that's how I got introduced to nature. And I think, particularly in behavioural terms, there are very few people around out there who can give young people and people in general that kind of experience. And interesting enough, it came through the Project Wild Thing film, is just how do we trip people over into that very kind of nature light? Because generally speaking, we tend to be nature heavy because we're passionate about it, and we tend to project that to people, and almost we're giving them too much. One of the interesting things, just to wrap up, that I don't think comes through strongly in all of these, but is a feature of the society we live in, is there is, generally speaking, a big lack of autonomy. And if you think about our lives in general, we are surrounded by stories that have been effectively described by organisations, whether it's Nike, Coke, Reebok, Apple, Microsoft, National Trust, RSPB. These organisations' brand positions and stories, which we are conveniently buying into, either personally or with our cash, effectively, in an odd way, as an application of our own autonomy to identify our own selves, to develop our own stories. We borrow these stories, and we borrow these brand positionings as, you know, dressings and labels, if you like, to present our stories to the outside world and the people around us. And I think that's a really challenging dynamic for the sorts of stuff we want to do, which is much more about, you know, the motivation is driven much more about individual autonomy. Sorry.
Can I just make a very quick point about this thing about nature guides and also about stories? Because I've had some experience recently of actually going on walks with people who are better informed about certain aspects of the natural world than I am, and with groups of people. And the thing that makes people engage every time, in my experience, is when that knowledgeable person tells a story about a particular animal, maybe a story about, you know, how we used them in the past, or it may be some really strange and interesting fact about them, but identification is not enough.
Yeah.
People need those little stories, and they really home in on, and I've heard this time and again, they've always said, that was really interesting.
Yeah. Really capturing people's imagination. Okay, I think we need to draw to an end there, Jane. Thank you very much for your new engagement. Hopefully it's been useful for you. And I do get the sense. Deborah, I didn't ask the question. Do you think these sorts of ideas have relevance and value for what you do?
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, thank you very much for the feedback. And thank you, Chris, for really stimulating. Probably wasn't long enough. You probably could have done it another hour. I mentioned to Chris when we spoke before the conference, a little Chinese proverb which is worth bearing in mind. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. And I'm sure that's very familiar to you. Please join with me to thank Chris once again.